Photographers shall visit foreign parts, the palaces of the Pashas, the Red Sea and the Holy Land, and bring home all the sublime and ridiculous objects that now cost so much to see.
That's how the National Gazette of Philadelphia saw the advent of photography back in the 1840s. Before the coming of the railways at the beginning of the 19th century, only the leisured classes traveled for pleasure, and the Alps were the natural centerpiece of every grand tour. Leisure is now one of the fastest growing industries, and some 200 million tourists trip around the globe each year, seeing the sights and taking billions of pictures, a mass memory hoard of good times and spectacle. 100 years ago, this mountain area around Mont Blanc was just becoming the adventure playground for the well-to-do. In those days, most people had barely seen the world outside their own horizons. But photography was to change that. In an age hungry for information, the camera became its traveling eye. In Europe, the Alps provided the most spectacular experience, and the early French photographers took full advantage of it. When Napoleon III came here with his Empress Eugénie in 1860, he commanded two French photographers, the Bisson brothers, to come with them to record the climb. The Bisson brothers certainly caught the grand scale of the Alps, but they dwarfed the emperor and his party. A year later, the Bissons came back, and with 25 porters to carry their equipment, they set off up the highest mountain in Europe, Mont Blanc. It took them 3 days to get to the summit and take their pictures. And down below in the town of Chamonix, they celebrated the camera's conquest of the Alps with a salute of guns. As the Victorian middle class grew and prospered, they opened up new tourist trails looking for education and adventure. For photographers, the strongest lure also came from the East, and soon after its invention in 1839, the camera was off exploring the Bible lands. One early expedition was made by Maxime Ducombe, a gentleman who just took along a camera when he and the French novelist Flaubert toured Egypt. In those days, photography was a tiresome business. Ducombe dabbled for this one trip, then appears to have lost interest. His paper prints still have a cold, grey tone, and he often took the amateur's way out by sticking local people in shot just to give scale. Today, the ruins of ancient Egypt are a familiar enough scene, but 130 years ago, the first sight of these photographs must have had a great impact in an age which was still deeply religious and devoted to its Bible stories. This fascination with the Middle East was turned to commercial advantage by an Englishman, Francis Frith. Frith made several trips to Egypt and the Holy Land, and his were the first photographs to have a worldwide distribution. The Times of London declared reverentially that these were the most important photographs ever published. They were also among the most profitable. Some of Frith's negatives were as big as 16 inches by 20 inches, and from them he made thousands of prints for stereo cards and books, and he even made the first Bible to be illustrated with photographs. Working in the desert was an ordeal. Sand and flies stuck to the wet plates, and it sometimes got so hot in Frith's developing tent that his chemicals boiled. But in the hazardous business of travel photography, the honours must go to another Englishman, Samuel Bourne. In 1861, Bourne had gone to India and set up shop. At first, like the many other English photographers active in the subcontinent, he was attracted by what seemed alien and exotic. In 1863, Bourne took to the hills and made his reputation. Using inflated buffalo skins, he crossed the rivers in the foothills of the Himalayas with 60 native porters to carry his kit. As well as the loads of chemicals, glass plates and heavy cameras, Bourne sustained his gentlemanly style with supplies of brandy, bundles of books, sporting equipment, and even the odd piece of furniture. As the party climbed higher and life got more dangerous, some of the porters dumped the gear and tried to run away, but the fanatical Bourne beat them back into line. One of these photographic expeditions through the mountains of Kashmir took 10 months, and on his final trip, Bourne reached the Manarong Pass, 18,600 feet up in the Himalayas, higher than any photographer had ever gone before. As Bourne himself said, photographic enthusiasm could go no further. Beyond the Himalayas lay China, an empire in disintegration. Its people were photographed in the 1860s by a Scotsman called John Thomson. Old traditions were crumbling, and this woman is committing an indecent act for the camera. In front of a man, and presumably for money, she was persuaded to unwrap the bandages from her deformed feet, which had been tightly bound since childhood. The Manchu dynasty had once been protected by its fierce bannermen, but now the warriors were hooked on opium, victims of the most ruthless drug peddlers of the 19th century, the British. Thomson's approach was documentary, and he composed with a frankness ahead of his time. He went mainly for the social detail of Chinese life, but if required, he could also adopt the classic style of the Victorian landscape photographer. The men with the camera in this old scroll are Americans, members of a naval force that broke open the closed kingdom of Japan in 1853. Sadly, the daguerreotypes they took have been lost. When the foreigners came back in the 1860s, the photographers again followed them in. One of the best was a well-travelled Venetian called Felix Beato. We don't have a picture of him, but we do have this portfolio which bears his stamp, and it captures the stylized quality of old Japan. Some photographs which are attributed to Beato are also delicately tinted by hand. The Americans who prodded Japan out of its medieval torpor had still not finished exploring their own vast territories. California and the far west of America had attracted thousands of immigrants during the gold rush of '49, and in the wake of the prospectors came the photographers, searching the wilderness this time for striking landscapes. They found the most dramatic ones in what is now Yosemite National Park. The Yosemite Valley was only a 2-day journey from the coast of California, and it was here that the art of American landscape photography first flourished in the 1860s. Now, it was popular for a number of reasons. At that time, the educated classes were in the middle of a long romance with nature, and a lot of ordinary Americans simply wanted to see how wild the West really was. The photographers of this wilderness were not pioneers with some offbeat hobby. These were serious professionals out from San Francisco who were probably already influenced by the work of Francis Frith in the Middle East and the Bisson brothers in the Alps.
The most successful mountain photographer was Carleton Watkins. Public demand for these landscape pictures can be explained partly by the popularity of the stereoscope, that viewing device which allowed these landscapes to be seen in three-dimensional depth. Watkins' exposures could take as long as an hour, and he would wait for perfectly still days to get his trees unblurred. He also used large plate glass negatives to capture the grandeur. Today, Yosemite is a protected wilderness, and some of the credit for its conservation must go to the early photographers who advertised its wonders. This outcrop of rock, El Capitan, soon became one of the classic views in every landscape photographer's collection. The professionals would compete for the same view and hope that their particular style would then appeal to the buying public.
There's actually a lot more going on in some of these old pictures of the West than at first sight meets the eye. For instance, that mountain over there is called Starr King, and it's named after the Reverend Starr King, a gentleman who was deeply opposed to the theories of Charles Darwin and evolution. Now, natural history was one of the passions of the time because Darwin had assaulted the very foundations of Orthodox Christianity and Orthodox science. And, strange as it now seems, some of those old pictures of the West were actually taken to try and prove Darwin wrong.
Some photographers like Watkins believed in a strange theory called catastrophism, which argued from visual evidence that the Earth was obviously not molded over ages of evolution, but was thrown up dramatically by divine wrath. This unnatural-looking rock, photographed by Watkins, was in fact named after America's leading natural scientist, Louis Agassiz, who also used such photographs in his futile attempt to disprove Darwin. Another follower was Tim O'Sullivan, who helped map the deserts of the American Southwest for the government. Many of his subjects and compositions can be read today as visual propaganda for the catastrophe theory. With the end of the Civil War in the 1860s, the Americans set out in earnest to tame their Wild West. First came the survey expeditions complete with photographic wagons. Then came the railway, which brought the next generation of settlers, who soon mastered the wilderness. For explorers and photographers, there now remained the ultimate journey, the most pitiless and in some ways the most beautiful, the journey across the ice caps to the poles. In 1845, Sir John Franklin set out for the North Pole. The camera simply took daguerreotype portraits of the leaders, but didn't go with them, which was just as well. Franklin and his entire company of 128 men all perished. Another British naval expedition set out to reach the North Pole some 30 years later. Again it failed, but by now developments in technique at least allowed the photographers to take pictures in the intense cold. other expeditions were mounted by an artist who made a career out of these Arctic scenes with their translucent light and strange shapes and sparkle. The American artist William Bradford had sailed north many times in the 1860s, and he took along his own photographers to make prints of the scenes, which then inspired awe in the picture-buying public. The tragic climax of what was called the polar passion of the Anglo-Saxons came in the early years of this century with the attempt by Captain Scott to reach the South Pole. Captain Scott took with him an experienced cameraman called Herbert Ponting. Ponting was a professional, and he even managed to get a shot of an iceberg by flashlight in the dark Antarctic winter. He worked hard in extreme conditions, but he was well organized and well equipped. He also took pictures of his own efforts to entertain the crew. Captain Scott and 4 of his men did finally reach the South Pole, but on the way back, all of them died in the snow. Herbert Ponting had put together a fascinating record of that Scott expedition. His later photography never again reached the same heights. But by then, the great age of exploration was over.
In the next episode of Camera, Caught in Time, the camera becomes the eye of history. Gus MacDonald shows how Victorian photographers were on hand to record the great events which helped lay the foundation of our own age.